How Europe let Ukraine fight alone. When Russia sent columns of tanks and planes into Ukraine on February 24, 2022, Europe's capitals responded with a flurry of statements, condemnations, pledges of support, sanctions, and promises to arm Kyiv. For a while, the image of a united West standing with a vulnerable democracy held. Streets filled with rallies, governments passing relief packages, and the rhetoric of never again returned to European discourse. But beneath the moral clarity lay a slower, quieter, and ultimately decisive reality. Europe's response was uneven, hesitant, and constrained by structural weaknesses. The result was more than diplomatic failure. It was a material one. Shortages of ammunition at critical moments, delayed deliveries of heavy weapons, energy dependencies that limited political choices, and sanctions that leaked cash back to Moscow. Those failures did not cause the war. Vladimir Putin started this war. But European policies and paralysis allowed him to prosecute it in a way that kept Russian forces combat capable longer than they should have been, and left Ukraine to pay the blood price. This is not a claim of conspiracy. It is an accounting of politics, industry, and strategy. Below are the facts and the patterns that add up to what many Ukrainians and some Western analysts now call a betrayal, not of intent, but of outcomes. The ammunition crisis. How rhetoric outran reality. If there is a single blunt fact that exposes Europe's failure, it is this. Modern artillery wars are a numbers game, and Europe failed to deliver the numbers Ukraine needed at the speed it needed them. Ukrainian units routinely fired tens of thousands of rounds in major operations. Independent reporting and parliamentary inquiries documented that Ukraine needed hundreds of thousands of 155 millimeters shells per month to sustain offensive operations. European leaders promised to ramp up production. Brussels publicly projected the bloc could produce over 1,155 millimeters shells annually and announced plans to build capabilities. But investigative reporting and industry insiders found a much narrower gap between political promises and manufacturing reality. Actual production capacity for the most critical calibers was far lower than official estimates, with bottlenecks in propellant and fuse supply chains and no pre-existing contracts to guarantee long-term output. In short, the factories did not exist at the scale or speed the war demanded, and bureaucracy slowed the rest. The battlefield consequences were immediate. Ukrainian commanders repeatedly reported, and independent military assessments corroborated, that the tempo of operations was limited by ammunition availability. When stocks ran low, offensive stalled, defensive barrages thinned, counter-battery fire became less sustained. There were moments when Ukrainian forces achieved tactical surprise or local superiority, but could not exploit it because they lacked the rounds to suppress enemy artillery or to create corridors for mechanized advances. Those lost opportunities add up in war. The politics of hesitation, no-fly zone, and the calculus of escalation. From the earliest days of the assault, Kyiv and many Western observers urged NATO to impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine. For the alliance, the proposal was a red line. Enforcing it would require NATO aircraft to shoot down Russian jets or intercept missiles launched from Russian soil, inviting a direct confrontation between nuclear-armed powers. Washington and other capitals publicly rejected that route, arguing that a NATO-Russia shoot-down would be indistinguishable from direct war. That refusal was a rational risk calculation inside Western governments. But it was also a decisive political choice with clear military effects. Ukraine's airspace remained contested, and Russian aircraft and missile strikes continued to endanger civilians and to blunt Ukrainian maneuver warfare. The choice to avoid direct air intervention was a policy of minimization, minimizing NATO's risk while maximizing Ukrainian exposure. Why does that matter? Because air superiority and the ability to deny an adversary freedom of movement above the battlefield are force multipliers. Without at least partial air interdiction or substantially expanded Ukrainian air defenses delivered early, Ukraine's cities and supply lines remained vulnerable in ways that hampered sustained offensive operations. Germany's hesitation, history, law, and strategic cost. One country's political culture came to symbolize Europe's wider paralysis. Germany. Berlin's early reluctance to send Leopard 2 main battle tanks and other heavy systems to Ukraine in 2022 was driven by a complex mix of legal constraints, historical caution, and domestic political calculation. Yet the operational consequences were plain. Allies who could have fielded coordinated armored responses found themselves waiting for a signal from Berlin. Months passed before Germany shifted course, authorizing shipments that then had to be coordinated across many suppliers. The effect was a lost window. Heavy armor that might have helped secure and exploit breakthroughs arrived too late and in too small numbers to change the strategic calculus in certain sectors. The German case illustrates a broader truth about collective defense in Europe. When decisive action requires rapid cross-border coordination, single-country hesitancy becomes a continental bottleneck. Democracy and deliberation are virtues, but in wartime they can also be liabilities if they prevent timely decisions. Energy dependence as leverage, pipelines, patience, and politics. Europe's long economic entanglement with Russian energy, the pipelines, infrastructure investments, and trade ties, was not simply a matter of commercial convenience. It was a strategic vulnerability that constrained the political choices of many capitals in the first months after the invasion. For years, several European governments had prioritized relatively cheap and reliable supplies of gas and oil over the geopolitical risks of deepening reliance on Moscow. When Russia weaponized energy, cutting flows and threatening supplies, governments faced a painful trade-off: slam the door on Russian energy and risk a domestic energy crisis, or keep channels open and preserve some leverage for diplomacy. Europe moved, belatedly and under duress, to diversify supplies and impose price caps and sanctions. But the transition took time, and during that interval, energy revenues continued to fund Russia's war machine. Analysts have estimated that earlier or tougher application of price caps would have reduced Moscow's revenues substantially. The EU and other partners adopted measures in stages, and enforcement complexities left space for workarounds. The practical upshot: a strategic reliance that reduced the West's appetite for escalatory measures in the conflict's early phase and gave Russia fiscal room to continue fighting. Sanctions, blunt instruments, leaky enforcement. Western sanctions on Russia were unprecedented in scope, hitting banks, oligarchs, trade, and technology flows. Yet sanctions are not magic. Their effect depends on design, enforcement, and the ability to close off alternative markets. Critics documented how sanctions often produced intended pain, but also found ways to be circumvented through intermediaries, third country buyers, or the use of alternative trading routes. Europe's fragmented enforcement and differing national interests meant that, for protracted periods, Russian energy and commodity revenues remained high enough to sustain military operations. In short, sanctions signaled resolve but did not immediately choke off Moscow's capacity to fund its war effort. That outcome did not mean sanctions were pointless. They exacted real economic costs and narrowed Russia's options over the long run. But as instruments intended to tilt the battlefield or to force rapid strategic recalculation in Moscow, they were blunt and slow. The institutional and industrial gap, Europe's long structural neglect. To understand how Europe reached this point, one must look beyond the immediate crisis and at the decades of underinvestment and procurement failure that left the continent ill-prepared to scale military production quickly. Defense factories on the continent had been allowed to shrink, and procurement systems were often slow, nationalized, and bureaucratic. Converting civilian plants to shell production or retooling existing facilities for modern munitions requires contracts, legal certainty, and rapid financing. Exactly the things most European countries lacked in the face of an unexpected and sustained high-intensity war. Brussels and NATO eventually moved to aggregate demand, create joint procurement, and underwrite capacity expansion. But those were reactive measures, not pre-existing contingency plans. The time it takes to build industrial capacity, recruiting staff, securing raw materials like gunpowder and fuses, and certifying munitions, meant that political pledges could not immediately translate into battlefield supplies. In a war measured in months, not years, such delays are decisive. Information warfare and political fatigue. Beyond industry and diplomacy, the war has been fought in the realm of perception. Russia invested heavily in information operations aimed at eroding Western cohesion, amplifying political fractures, and promoting narratives of Western hypocrisy or exhaustion. European publics, rightly sensitive to economic costs, refugee inflows, and the human toll, showed signs of fatigue as the conflict dragged on. Polls in many countries registered declining enthusiasm for continued military support as the immediate shock of the 2022 invasion receded. Populist parties and politicians used that fatigue to argue for restraint, complicating leaders' ability to sustain a high-cost, high-risk posture in support of Ukraine. Democracies must respond to public sentiment. But when public fatigue is stoked by disinformation, and when policymakers fail to explain the stakes clearly, the result is policy that follows the politics rather than the strategy. The battlefield evidence: attrition favors the side with deeper stocks. Independent military analysts have repeatedly charted the operational consequences of these political and industrial shortcomings. Russia's initial operational setbacks were met with a long, grinding adaptation. Mobilization of reserve forces, retooling of logistics, and the deliberate stockpiling and use of artillery and missile systems. Ukraine, conversely, often found itself limited by consumables. Analysts tracking the front lines documented instances where Russian forces, after absorbing Ukrainian attacks, could rebuild positions or launch counterattacks, as Ukrainian ammunition stocks dwindled or armored reinforcements lagged. Attrition warfare, which privileges the side that can endure and resupply, is a grim arithmetic, and that arithmetic has favored the better supplied or more rapidly resupplied force. Was it betrayal or mismanagement? Betrayal is a loaded term. For many in Kiev, it captures the moral sting of receiving stirring rhetoric, but insufficient means. For Western leaders, most of whom acted without malice and with a genuine desire to help, the problem was organizational. Democracies constrained by risk-averse electorates, legal checks, and industrial limits are slower to act than autocracies that can mobilize resources at will. Still, outcomes matter. When months of hesitation, bottlenecks in production, and the politics of risk combine to allow an aggressor to consolidate control over territory gained or to preserve its fighting capacity, the political support that stops short of decisive action becomes a form of practical abandonment. The difference between intention and outcome is not merely academic. For Ukrainians defending towns and hospitals, the question is not whether European leaders sympathized. It is whether they provided the capacity to hold and to recover. What Europe must do now, and why delay hurts everyone. If the West wants to reverse the pattern that has left Ukraine fighting with inadequate means, it must act on three fronts simultaneously. First, industrial mobilization. Europe must treat munitions and heavy equipment manufacturing as critical infrastructure akin to energy or telecommunications in wartime. That means long-term contracts, stockpiles, incentives for rapid expansion, and bureaucratic streamlining so factories can be repurposed or built without the multi-year delays that characterized the early war response. The EU's later measures to coordinate procurement and fund capacity are steps in the right direction. But they came too late for many of the conflict's early inflection points. Second, a clearer and more credible deterrence posture. If NATO and European governments are unwilling to impose a no-fly zone, they must instead deliver layered air defenses, long-range interdiction tools, and logistical support that meaningfully degrade an aggressor's ability to strike at will. Avoiding direct confrontation with Russia is a legitimate policy choice. But it must not be an excuse for inaction that leaves an ally to endure disproportionate harm. Third, sanctions and economic isolation must be enforced, not just legislatively, but operationally. Closing loopholes, tracking re-exports, and coordinating with non-European partners to prevent circumvention are essential if sanctions are to do more than signal displeasure. Simultaneously, energy independence must be accelerated so political decisions are not hostage to winter heating needs or short-term market shocks. Acting now is not merely an expression of solidarity. It is enlightened self-interest. A Europe that tolerates large-scale aggression on its border invites instability, refugee flows, and a new normal in which force trumps law. A continent that rebuilds its industrial base and modernizes its deterrence posture makes itself and its neighbors safer for decades. The moral balance sheet. History will render a harsher verdict on collective European action in this crisis than the polite diplomatic statements offered in public. The record will show that Europe had tools, capacities, and relationships that could, if marshaled rapidly and resolutely, have materially altered parts of the conflict. Instead, a mixture of fear of escalation, industrial unpreparedness, and political fragmentation allowed Russia to prosecute a war of attrition with fewer immediate costs than it might have otherwise faced. Again, this is not to absolve Russia. The invasion was a criminal act of aggression, and Moscow bears full responsibility for death, displacement, and destruction. But accountability is not reserved for aggressors alone. Democracies and alliances must be judged by whether they back their words with the means necessary to prevent mass violence and the seizure of sovereign territory. If Europe wants to salvage its moral leadership and prevent worse wars tomorrow, it must stop assuming that resolve and rhetoric is sufficient. Resolve, indeed, the hard, costly, politically unpopular kind, is the only remedy that will keep the continent safe and stop the next would-be aggressor from calculating that the price of conquest is bearable. Sources and further reading. Key reporting and analyses underpinning this article include investigative work on European artillery production and procurement challenges, NATO and policy analyses of the no-fly zone debates and nuclear escalation risks, reporting on Germany's early reluctance to export heavy armor, and academic and think tank assessments of the war's operational dynamics. For essential factual grounding, see reporting and institutional studies on European ammunition production and the EU's ammunition plan, Institute for the Study of War Campaign Assessments, contemporaneous coverage of Germany's tank debates, NATO briefings and policy papers explaining the no-fly zone calculus, and economic analyses of sanctions and Russian energy revenues.